In the grey silence before dawn, 1623, the halls of Topkapı Palace trembled with a sound that hadn't been heard in centuries, a scream, not of war, not of childbirth. It was the cry of a 15-year-old princess, Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I, the ruler of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Guards froze where they stood, servants hid behind marble pillars. That single sound, sharp, desperate, echoing through the silk-lined corridors, felt like a curse whispered through time. But no one dared move, because everyone knew when a daughter of the Sultan screamed, it was not their place to listen. For centuries, the Ottoman court had been a place of glitter and gold. Poets sang of beauty, travelers wrote of endless luxury, and every child in the empire dreamed of being born within those jeweled walls. But what the world didn't know was that behind the perfumes and poetry, there was a ritual, a secret, that no history book would ever mention. That scream was the sound of that secret breaking through, and it belonged to Princess Fatma, a girl raised to be a symbol of purity, power, and grace, yet destined to become a prisoner of her own dynasty. Princess Fatma was born into perfection. Her cradle was carved from mother of pearl, her first steps taken on carpets worth kingdoms. Outside her window, the domes of Istanbul glowed like molten gold in the morning sun. Every sound she heard, the call to prayer, the music of the court, reminded her she was a daughter of destiny. But from the very beginning, her destiny was not hers to shape. Fatma's father, Sultan Ahmed I, ruled an empire feared by half the world. Her mother, Kösem Sultan, was one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, a woman who could bend the will of viziers with a glance. To outsiders, Fatma was royalty itself, the most privileged child on earth. But to those who lived inside the palace, they knew a cruel truth. The more royal your blood, the less freedom you had. While other children played in the courtyards, Fatma spent her days memorizing scriptures, learning calligraphy, studying Persian poetry, and tracing the constellations on the ceiling of her chamber. She spoke 4 languages before she was 12. Her tutors whispered that her mind was brighter than her father's. And yet, the closer she grew to understanding the stars, the less she understood her own life. Why did her every movement have to be approved? Why did her mother speak of marriage as if it were execution? Why did the walls of her palace feel like they were closing in, not with age, but with expectation? Because from the moment she was born, Fatma was not seen as a daughter, she was seen as a promise, a diplomatic bond, a living signature waiting to be traded. By 15, she knew that her life, her marriage, her body, her future, would not belong to her. They would belong to the empire, and when the imperial seal fell upon her name, that promise was about to be collected. Fatma's fate was sealed with a letter. One afternoon, while the call to prayer echoed across the Bosphorus, a golden scroll arrived from the Sultan's council chamber, her marriage decree. Her husband was chosen, Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, a decorated commander twice her age, whose victories in Persia had earned him scars and glory in equal measure. For him, marriage to the Sultan's daughter meant power. For her, it meant disappearance. No one asked for her consent. No one even looked her in the eyes when they told her. When she whispered to her mother, "Is there no other way?" Kösem Sultan turned away, not in cruelty, but in resignation. She knew too well that in the empire's hierarchy, even a mother could not save her daughter from politics. And so began the ritual. It was called Terbiye-i Mubarek, the sacred education, a phrase that sounded divine, but what it truly meant was preparation for submission. Only princesses underwent it, and no one outside the palace walls ever saw what it entailed. On the first morning, Fatma was led into a chamber draped in black silk, lit only by oil lamps. At the center stood an elderly woman, Gulnar Hatun, the mistress of training, a figure both feared and revered. She had prepared 12 princesses before Fatma, and each had left her care quieter, paler, and emptier than before. From this day on, Gulnar said, you no longer belong to yourself. You belong to destiny. The doors shut behind her. What followed were weeks of ritual disguised as refinement, learning to move, to speak, to serve, to obey. Every gesture was practiced until it no longer belonged to the will. She was made to bow in 18 precise ways, each one representing humility before her husband. She learned to walk with her head tilted at a perfect angle, never higher than his heart. Her speech was stripped down to 43 permitted words, words of gratitude, apology, or acceptance. Every sentence, every movement, every breath was a lesson in how to disappear. When she faltered, she was locked in silence. Not punishment, but reflection, as they called it. Days without speaking, eating, or light, until she learned what they expected, that a princess's pride was a flaw, not a virtue. And yet, inside her, the fire had not gone out. Late at night, she would whisper to herself fragments of poems she once loved, verses about stars, freedom, and infinity. But even those whispers were heard. By the end of the third week, they made her memorize passages praising obedience as the highest form of devotion. The princess who once studied the sky was being trained to never look up again. The human mind doesn't break all at once. It bends, slowly, silently, until one day it can't remember what straight ever felt like. That was the real purpose of the sacred education. Not pain, not bruises, transformation. After 40 days of training, Fatma was taken from her familiar rooms and led into a chamber known only by whispers, the pavilion of reflection. No guards stood at its door, no laughter echoed within. The walls were covered entirely in Venetian mirrors, floor to ceiling, polished so perfectly that even the flicker of a candle looked like infinity. Gulnar Hatun stood behind her and said only one thing: "From now on, you will be your own watcher." In that room, Fatma's lessons became invisible. She was told to kneel before her own reflection for hours, watching herself breathe, bow, stand, and smile on command. If she showed defiance, her reflection became her punishment. Because every time she failed, the matrons whispered, "Look, even the mirror rejects you." The technique had a name, Murakaba. Once a Sufi meditation for awareness, it had been twisted into an instrument of control. Here, it wasn't used to find God, but to erase the self. For hours, she would recite verses written centuries earlier, words that praised silence as purity, submission as strength, and each repetition chipped away at the person she had been. Her books were taken, her ink and quills vanished, the stars she once studied gone behind curtained windows. Even her name began to fade. In the pavilion, the matrons called her not Fatma Sultan, but the bride, a title that sounded sacred but meant possession. They anointed her body with perfumed oils mixed by court alchemists, jasmine, amber, poppy. The fragrance was intoxicating, calming, almost divine. But hidden within it were herbs meant to dull the senses and cloud the will. Every day she felt lighter, not from peace, but from absence. The voice that once argued, questioned, dreamed, was being replaced by echoes of commands that were not her own. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a spark refused to die. When everyone slept, she would press her forehead to the cold marble and whisper to the stars she could no longer see, "If you can hear me, remember me. Don't let the sky forget my name." On the morning of March 15th, 1623, Istanbul awoke to a festival. The city glittered as if the heavens themselves had come down to watch. Trumpets blared from the palace gates, perfumed smoke spiraled from golden censers, and the streets overflowed with people celebrating what they believed to be the happiest day of a princess's life. But behind those jeweled doors, Fatma's world was collapsing in perfect silence. While dancers spun in the courtyards and musicians sang of eternal love, the young princess sat motionless in her chamber, her eyes fixed on the same mirror that had once trained her to obey. The reflection staring back was beautiful, composed, and completely unfamiliar. Around her, attendants dressed her in the bridal robe of submission, a masterpiece of white silk and gold thread that shimmered like sunlight on water. To the outside world, it was a royal gown, but hidden beneath the layers were clasps and cords meant to restrict movement, to remind her she belonged not to herself, but to the empire. Her mother, Kösem Sultan, entered briefly. For a long moment, neither spoke. The great queen's eyes were distant, filled with pride, fear, and something she couldn't say aloud. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "My daughter," she whispered, "some crowns are not made of gold. Some are made of silence." Then she left before her tears could be seen. By sunset, the wedding procession began. Outside, fireworks split the sky. Drums thundered from the Janissary barracks. The call of celebration rolled across the Bosphorus like waves of light. Inside, Fatma was escorted to the Gelin Köşkü, the bride's pavilion, a structure built centuries earlier for royal unions. No sound from the festivities could reach inside, only the rustle of her gown and the steady heartbeat of fear. The pavilion was built in 3 levels, each representing a stage of the ritual: purification, surrender, completion. In the first chamber, she was bathed for hours in rosewater and sandalwood, not for cleanliness, but for symbolism. The matrons whispered prayers over her as oils laced with narcotics numbed her skin. She felt her thoughts blur, like fog rolling across her mind. In the second, she was dressed again, but this time the gown was heavier. Her bracelets clinked like chains. Even her crown was weighted with iron beneath the gold. And in the final chamber, the candles burned low and the air grew cold. There, waiting in silence, was her husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man forged by war, now standing before a girl forged by obedience. The empire would call what followed a sacred union. But for Fatma, it was the moment the stars went out. By dawn, the celebration outside still roared, but inside the pavilion, the only sound was the flutter of a silk curtain and the faint, uneven breath of a girl who had become a ghost. By the time the morning sun touched the domes of Topkapı, the empire was already celebrating. Drummers filled the courtyards, poets recited verses of devotion, and the Sultan's council announced to the world that Princess Fatma was now a married woman, a symbol of harmony, strength, and divine order. But inside the palace there was no harmony, only silence. When the matrons entered her chamber at dawn, they found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her veil still in place, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her lips moved faintly, but no words came out, not a scream, not a sob, just air. The court physicians recorded what they called shock of the soul. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, her pulse raced, her breath came in fragments. She couldn't bear the sound of a man's footsteps. Even the eunuchs who served the harem found her flinching at their shadows. Days passed, then weeks. Fatma refused food, speech, or sleep. The brilliant girl who once debated scholars now spoke in whispers, if at all, sometimes only a single word, enough. The matrons blamed weakness, the physicians blamed melancholy. But the truth was simpler. Her mind had fled to survive what her body could not escape. Her husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, requested reassignment to the Eastern Front. He left the palace within months, claiming duty, but those who saw his eyes before he departed said he looked like a man haunted, not by guilt, but by what obedience had made him become. Meanwhile, the empire spun the story differently. Chroniclers wrote that Fatma had fallen ill from the strains of royal ceremony. The public heard of a delicate princess recovering from exhaustion. Behind those words was a silence so thick it swallowed truth itself. Years passed. Fatma lived, but she did not live. She attended banquets, sat beside her mother at ceremonies, even bore children who would never know her warmth. Her gaze, always distant, seemed to linger on something no one else could see, a horizon beyond the palace walls. To the world, she was the model of composure, soft-spoken, graceful, obedient. But in private, her servants often found her awake at night, tracing constellations on the ceiling with her fingers. The stars she had once studied, now her only witnesses. Some said she prayed. Others whispered that she waited, not for dawn, but for the quiet that comes after it. Princess Fatma died 29 years later, in the spring of 1652, on the anniversary of her wedding. The official record said brain fever, but in the quiet corners of the palace, everyone knew it wasn't illness that took her. It was memory. She was buried with ceremony and music. Her coffin carried through gardens blooming with jasmine, the same scent that once perfumed her sacred education. Her husband, far away on campaign, sent word of mourning, though some whispered his relief. The empire moved on. New princesses were born, new alliances arranged, and Fatma's story was quietly sealed away in the archives. But history has a strange habit. Secrets never stay buried forever. Centuries later, in 2019, a historian in Istanbul stumbled upon a set of hidden documents in the palace archives, coded journals, ceremonial records, and personal notes from harem matrons. Within those fragile pages, the forgotten truth resurfaced. Princess Fatma was not alone. There were dozens of names: Aishi, Beyhan, Mihrima, Esma, Shah Sultan. Each one followed the same path, married by decree, trained through sacred education, and erased by silence. Some retreated into isolation, some went mad. A few, desperate, defiant, found their own ways to end their story. and a handful disappeared from the records entirely, their names replaced with phrases like transferred to unknown estate. In other words, erased. The world saw the Ottoman princesses as icons of luxury, silk gowns, jeweled crowns, lives of ease. But behind every painting, every poem, was a girl who never chose her fate. A daughter traded for diplomacy, a voice turned into ritual, and yet, even under that mountain of silence, something survived: resistance, letters written in invisible ink, hidden poems embroidered into sleeves, tiny rebellions that history almost missed. Through those fragments, a pattern emerged, not of submission, but of endurance. Fatma and her sisters may have been silenced, but their whispers still echo through time. That power without empathy is only another form of imprisonment, and that even in the deepest darkness, the human spirit finds ways to be heard. So when we look at the great palaces of history, the marble, the gold, the endless stories of kings and empires, we must ask, how many voices were buried beneath them? How many daughters were taught to smile while breaking inside? Princess Fatma's life is not just a tragedy, it's a mirror, a reflection of what happens when tradition and control masquerade as honor. And perhaps that's why, even now, her story refuses to fade. Because somewhere in the silence of Topkapı's halls, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of a girl who once screamed, not from rebellion, but from the unbearable cost of obedience.